Hi, my name is Lee and I'm the creator of Licked Pattern Kits, and today I'm going to show you how to master the art of draping. I've broken the draping process down into 4 stages, and stage 1 is all about setting yourself up for success. First things first, you'll need to find something to drape on. I prefer mannequins over people because they stay still and you can stick pins in them. And I can leave my drape overnight, have a think about it, and come back to it in the morning. If you are draping sleeves or off-the-shoulder styles, don't forget to grab some arms too. The next step is to find yourself a base to drape on. Please don't skip this step. Why drape on a base? Firstly, you can draw the neckline, armhole, and any style lines on the base so you'll know where to stop your drape. And once your drape is finished, you can simply trim along these lines and the base's seams to get the finished edge of your pattern. Secondly, you can create gravity-defying shapes by stitching the drape to the base at key points. See how this pin is holding the drape up? This is where I would need to stitch the drape to my base. And if I don't, the drape will fall down. Where can you find a base? You want the base to be simple. It should keep darts to a minimum and have a similar silhouette to your design. Blocks, which are a basic simplified pattern, are perfect for this. And if you're creating a draped fitted dress, the block in my 1 dart fitted dress kit will work perfectly. And you can purchase this kit on my website, clickedpatternkits.com. And this is the block I have my mannequin, without the sleeves and collar. A couple of final things before we start draping. Make sure you have pins, scissors, and markers. I love using a purple vanishing marker to draw my lines. Then you'll need a range of different coloured markers or pens to mark your drape. And last but not least, you'll need fabric to drape with. It can be a scrap of old fabric, like this one, but make sure you drape in a fabric similar to your final fabric. So if you're using silk crepe, find a cheaper polyester crepe. The fabric should also be a light colour so you can see all the markings you've made when you remove your drape. This will make your life so much easier, trust me. Now on to stage 2. This video will show you how to create nice, clean drapes that are easy to turn into a pattern. This doesn't mean your design has to be simple, can be complex, but your drape shouldn't be messy. Having a messy drape just makes it harder to turn into a pattern. Let's get started. The first tip is to create your borders. You've already toiled your block to use as a base, so the next step is to draw your design's necklines and any style lines. This will give you the parameters for your drape, so you'll know where to start and finish it. Tip number 2 is to cut enough fabric for your drape. Be generous. You never know where your drape will take you, and it doesn't really work when you pin extra fabric to extend your drape. Keep the fabric smooth and taut. Gently push the fabric as you drape it to avoid having any excess. Don't stretch the fabric, but make sure it's taut. This is especially important at the seams. If there is excess at the seams, you'll have to work out how to remove it later, which can be really tricky, especially if it's under layers of folds. Put the work in now and save yourself the headache later, and move any excess into your drape. Tip number 4, avoid unnecessary bulk and layers. It's easy to get carried away when you start draping, but if you've added folds you can no longer see, it's best to go back and redrape the section. I know it sounds like a pain, but imagine all the bulk created by 2, 3, or 4 folds. It really builds up. Bulky seams don't look good or feel good, and they're a pain to sew. Use the slash and spread technique to add volume. So this technique is a bit messy, but it's a quick way to add volume to a flounce or skirt. The slash and spread technique is a flat pattern cutting technique. It just means cutting into the paper at the point where you want to add volume, then spreading the paper till you've added the desired amount of volume. And you can do the same thing with fabric. It's important to release tension along the curves while you drape. This is especially important at the neck, armhole, and waist. And you can do this by simply snipping along the edge of the fabric with scissors. And last but not least, get in the habit of inserting your pins diagonally. It's the fastest, most efficient way to secure your fabric. Stage 3 will show you how to successfully mark and remove your drape. Remember, while a design may look complex, the drape should be beautifully simple and easy to put together. So this is the drape I'm going to remove and turn into a pattern. As you can see, I've draped on a base in a light coloured fabric. I've included a couple of gravity-defying sections so I can show you how to attach your drape to your base. I've also included some partially stitched folds so I can show you how to create what I call stitch lines, but more on that later. Grab your markers, pens and pencils, and let's begin. When you're marking your drape, it's important to mark everything. Anything you don't mark will be lost when you take it off the mannequin. I'm going to start by marking my neckline, armhole, side seams and waist. Each seam should have at least one notch so you can connect it to other pattern pieces correctly. Remember to use a double notch on the back pieces. If you are having trouble marking the waist, a quick trick is to tie a measuring tape or ribbon around the smallest part and then draw your line. Then I'm going to mark my drape sections. The start and end of each fold, or any other design details like gathering, should be marked with a notch. It's best to use a fine-tipped pen or marker so the notches and lines are really accurate. You can then use a coloured marker to show which sections are draped together. I'm also putting a letter next to each notch so it's really obvious which points connect. It may seem like we're overdoing it, but the more information you note down now, the easier it will be to create your pattern. You can see that I'm marking along the start of each fold so that it will be partially stitched. I like to do this as it gives me greater control over the drape, and in my experience, folds that are partially stitched look much better when they're sewn too, especially in production. Drapes are very delicate, and if someone sews a fold half a centimetre off at the seam, it can really affect the drape. But partially stitching the fold ensures that the fold keeps its shape no matter what happens at the seam. On the upper part of the drape, I have several pins keeping the drape together, so I'll join these points to create a stitch line. By the time you finish your drape, you'll probably have a million pins in it, but you only need to mark the ones that are creating or securing your drape. If you aren't sure which ones you need to mark, remove a pin and then give your drape a very, very light pull to see if it holds its shape. If the drape holds its shape, you don't need to mark the pin. If the drape falls apart, put a notch at that pin. Another great way to record your drape is to press any folds with an iron. This will create crease lines so you can see where the folds were and whether they folded in or out. Trust me, this will really help once you've unfolded your drape. Great, so I've notched and ironed all my folds, drawn my neckline, side seams and waist. Now I'll just mark my center front points. Okay, that's a lot of information already. If your head is spinning, don't worry, this is all covered in the guide of my One Dart Fitted Dress Kit. Now that I've marked everything, I can trim my seams. Trimming the seams is a really quick way to find the edge of your pattern piece. But for this to work, you need to make sure all the layers of the drape reach the seam, otherwise the edge won't be correct. All the layers should be pinned together and each layer should be taut. And it's best to put the pin just inside the seam so the pin isn't in your way when you cut along it. I'll give the other seam a little trim too. So I've finished marking the outer layer. Now I'll mark where the drape needs to connect to the base, or what will become my lining pattern. The top two drapes here defy gravity and won't keep their shape unless they're connected to something, i.e. a lining. So I'll very carefully undo the drape so I can mark where both folds need to be attached to the base. And I think I'm done, but I'll just put my drape back together and do a final check to make sure I've marked everything. It's also a really good idea to take some photographs of your drape. You'd be surprised how quickly you forget what it looks like. Now I'll really carefully remove my drape. I want to keep the drape in one piece with all the folds and drapes still intact. You'll see why in a second. Take the drape to a table and grab a piece of paper and a pen. As you unfold the drape, I want you to note down what you do. When we come to make our pattern, these deconstruction notes will be reversed and become our construction notes, which we can give to our sample machinist or whoever is creating the pattern. As you unfold the drape, number each step and write what you did. For example, notch A and B fold up. You can also put the color from your drape next to it so it's really clear. Make sure you draw an arrow between connecting points. The arrow should point to where the fold is going. Take your time and take photos. I can't stress this enough. Once you undo a drape, you can't get it back. And last but not least, don't forget to draw your grain line. We are done. We've marked and removed our drape and created a deconstruction list, so we know exactly how we made our drape. We've made it to the last stage, and I'll be showing you how to create a pattern from your marked drape. And if you followed my tips so far, this stage will be much, much easier. Let's get started. The first step is to make sure you've cut enough paper for your pattern piece. If your drape is symmetrical, create both sides at the same time by folding the paper in half along the center front or back. Then draw the grain line on the paper. Lay the marked drape on top so the grain lines are parallel. Then pin the drape to the paper at the corners and along the seams to stop it from moving. You can use weights too. Then grab your tracing wheel and trace all the lines and notches. To mark the notches, you'll need to create a cross, so you have the exact point of the notch. If the seam has been trimmed, you can just draw along the edge with a pencil. Remove the drape slowly while checking all the markings have been copied across. Then, draw over the traced lines and notches. Smooth any bumpy edges as you go and use a ruler to draw the notches. Any notches within the pattern will become drill holes. And don't forget to label the center front, side seams, shoulder and waist. Now I wish I could say it was all done and all you have to do is add a 1 cm seam allowance and off you go, but you need to check your drape, especially where you've trimmed the seams. In 99% of cases, the sewn edge of a fold should be the same length, and any lines that are stitched together should be the same length, shape, and have notches or drill holes in the same position. So get your ruler and start measuring. If you find something that isn't quite right, rub it out and adjust it. In general, I would trust the notches you made inside your drape rather than the ones at the seams. With all the bulk from the folds, it's really easy for something to be half a centimetre or so out. You can also test the pattern by folding your paper. Fabric is obviously a lot more fluid, so it's not exactly the same, but it will give you a good idea. And you can also check the seams around the folds are a nice smooth shape too. Okay, I'm happy with my lines and notches, so now I'm going to transfer the colours I used on my marked drape to the pattern. I wouldn't do this for a production pattern, but if this pattern is being used to create a first sample, the colours will really help your sample machinist. Technically, when you hand over a pattern to a machinist, they should be able to do it without asking you any questions. It should be that clear. I'll then grab my deconstruction notes and reverse them to create my construction notes. I've included the colours on my construction notes too, and added more details, like stitch to lining, so the machinist will know what to do. I'll then write the sewing instructions on my pattern, and make sure all the arrows are there and go in the correct direction too. Amazing, we are done. Repeat these steps for each section of your drape. The guides in my clicked pattern cutting kits will then show you how to true your joining seams, check the seam angles, and select the best seam and hem finishes for your design. Once you've trued your seams and decided on your seam and hem finishes, you can then add your seam allowances. I'm going to test my pattern first before I add my seam allowances, so I'll grab my final fabric and cut out my pattern. I've cut out my pattern and I've also added the numbers from my construction notes, so it's really easy for my sample machinist to follow. Now for the moment of truth. It's looking pretty good. I'm happy with the bottom section here, but I think the stitch line is too long here. My final fabric has a little less give than my draping fabric, so it isn't fitting as well around the neck, so I'll adjust it here too. Now it's looking pretty good. Practice makes perfect, and creating patterns for small sections, like we did in this video series, is the best way to improve your draping and pattern cutting skills. We covered a lot of information in this series, and you can find all and so much more in my One Dart Fit Dress guide. I know I'm slightly biased, but my pattern kits really are worth the investment. For the same price as hiring a pattern cutter for 2 hours, you'll get a perfectly fitted block to use as the base for your pattern, and a guide that will walk you through the whole pattern cutting process, step by step. There is no pattern cutting book like it. Plus, you can use each kit again and again for different designs. And you can purchase this kit on my website, clickedpatternkits.com. We're doing more draping tutorials soon, so subscribe to my channel to stay in touch.